if any geopolitical conversation was to occur based on Trump 2.0, it is the conversation of putting the boot in to China. Yes, China, of course, otherwise known as a knock-off economy, has been knocking off stuff for years. Welcome to the Urban Property Investor. I'm your host, Sam Saggers, here to help you crack the code of real estate wealth. Today's show, we're talking the big D, yes, the economics of a second Trump presidency, the impacts of Trump 2.0. How will the world fare if the big D makes it to the White House? I think it's worth a conversation after the most recent political particulars unfolded in America. Of course, we had the assassination attempt on Donald Trump, and no one likes to see that stuff. But Americans, I tell you what, they're pretty patriotic and they take this stuff pretty seriously over there. Every third house has an American flag flying out the front of it. And of course, there is a lot of energy put into politics in America. Here we don't necessarily try and, assassinate our politicians. No one's trying to assassinate Albo. You will see the odd pie in the face trick here in Australia, which I think, is a nice way to, pick on a politician. But certainly no one likes to see crazy assassination attempts. I think that's taking things a bit too far. But what has happened with that assassination attempt, it has certainly put Donald Trump in a front-running standing with the electorate in America to take over the presidency. And of course, we've recently seen the decline of Sleepy Joe and the eventual demise of Sleepy Joe finally stepping down from running again, which would have made him the world's oldest leader. And of course, it was pretty clear that his cognitive decline was not good when you're telling the president of the Ukraine that he's the president of Russia. I guess it's time to go. So what will the economic impacts of a second Trump plausible presidency be? And of course, no one really knows. No one's got a crystal ball. There's plenty of other capable candidates. But if President Trump was to get in, what does it mean for you and me? What does it mean for you and me as a property investor, Australian resident? What does it mean for Australia? Some very good questions to answer. And I thought today, why not? Let's try and tackle some geopolitical conversations. I got a text from James at my work asking me what my thoughts are. And really, that's what prompted today's show. What are my thoughts on the economics of the second presidency of the Big D? So that's the show today, folks. And of course, welcome back. If you're tuning in again, thank you for coming back to the program. I appreciate your earballs. Thank you for tuning in. And if it's your first time tuning into the show, well, play the program in double speed. Get your life back, as we say here on the Urban Property Investor. And all the episodes I've done are lessons on real estate in one way, shape, or form. So feel free to go back in time. And of course, if you don't know me, my name's Sam Saggers. Big part of my job these days is simply sharing information and helping people understand how to get ahead through property. And of course, property is quite often affected by the economy. And today we're really looking at the Trump policies and how they may affect the global economy. And of course, the trickle-down effect of global impacts into the Australian economy. But it's fair to say Trump's had a pretty colourful past 12 months. He's had legal cases. He's a convicted felon. He's had a assassination attempt on his life. And of course, the most recent Mar-a-Lago documents got thrown out by a judge who said, who ruled in Trump's favor, basically not to investigate that further. Of course, Donald Trump had some private documents stored at his Mar-a-Lago castle, and the FBI gained entry and got those back. And we don't know if there will be an appeal. There probably will be, and we'll probably go through that sort of era where every second day there's people in America battling the demise of Donald Trump, and that politics at work effect. But I will say there are some capable candidates in America. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is someone that I tend to watch the work of. And of course, you've got Kamala Harris, who's just been endorsed by the Obamas to have a crack at the big D. Let's face it, Sleepy Joe was never going to get there. He was, my wife calls him the half-dead man. The half-dead man was never going to make it through the next presidency. So I don't know if at an American level, people are, going to what direction they're going to go. But it's fair to say it's worth a good conversation to analyze what Trump is running on. And really, the big D, if you like, is running on $4.6 trillion of tax cuts for corporations, reducing the corporations' tax rate to 15%, which is amazing. Like if you run a company like I do and you had such a low corporate tax rate, it would mean you would be able to create profit more easily and use that profit to stimulate local jobs and reinvestment into your corporation. Not just take profits off the table, but really use that extra money to grow your industry, to grow your corporation, to create more jobs for people. So Trump's running kind of on that, make America great again and get really the principle of capitalism moving in what is the world's best capitalist country. And of course, he wants to extend personal tax cuts to people as well. And he wants to take on China. He wants to create tariffs on China and really their goods that they send across the sea of anywhere to 60 to 100% tariff on a Chinese good. And of course, what that means, if you go down to your USA version of Bunnings, the $12 Chinese hammer is now a $25 Chinese hammer. And of course, Trump is running off the back of that. He started that trade war 1 with China, and he wants to continue to pursue that narrative moving into a second term in the White House. And of course, he wants to create a tariff on basically the EU for around 10% as well. And really what you would find off the back of that is a global power shift economically, which will certainly be worth discussing. And of course, obviously the border situation in America, from what I've observed, seems a little bit crazy at the moment. People just walking into America without any sort of way to sort of slow that down. I know here in Australia, we lose our marbles when 6 people float across the sea in a rubber boat as a refugee. Over in America, people are just walking across the border. So he's going to obviously fix that border issue. He's going to slash immigration, and he's going to boost student immigration. And of course, here in Australia, our whole ethos of economics is population economics. Take the world's students, turn them into basically our students, and help them grow through the visa system that way to become a permanent resident. So it does appear that if the Trump presidency succeeds, he's going down a similar road that Canada and Australia currently dominate, which is basically find the skill in the world and bring them to your country, as opposed to just anyone who wants to find a better life and enter a country that way. Find the skill and bring it to the country. And I know a lot of the tech billionaires that I listen to are very pro making America great again by bringing the best brains in the world to America and really linking that to industry. And obviously America's got some great tech industries. It spends a lot on research and development, way more than Australia. Australia does not spend enough money on research and development, and that is why most people's jobs in Australia are pretty basic level. Like there is no Google of Australia, there is no Facebook of Australia, there is no tech of real high-tech stuff going on in Australia. And it's because we don't spend any money on research and development. And obviously what you end up here in Australia is just really the fire economy. More people needing loans to buy houses, to get insurance, and more coffee shops being started, more local shops. And really that's the kind of, industry here in Australia. In America, it's the polar opposite. They're trying to build skilled base industries because they already have them. They just need the people connected to their skill-based industries to be more abundant. So that's what Trump's running on. And for a lot of people in America, that's a pretty popular kind of level of concepts. Make corporations bigger, extend personal tax cuts, stop basically competition from China, almost decouple themselves from basically cheap Chinese goods. And that's a popular notion in America, because obviously America also has had its fair share of its own manufacturing over the years. So really, from a global impact statement, you've really got 4 bits of what Donald Trump could bring to the White House that will affect other economies. 1, immigration. Immigration, obviously favoring students, will affect, obviously the world will want to bring students here. So we might have to, in effect, make it even easier for students to come here or give them some benefits for coming here. So the competition's going to get harder. And of course, if there's less immigration in from the Mexican border, that means there's going to potentially also see places like Mexico and other South American countries retain more of a workforce. And of course, that means probably more ability for those countries to grow their GDP because they've got really a bigger population. So America's looking to slow its population. Trade policies is going to be a big conversation piece, and we'll talk little bit about what those trade policies look like. Obviously, fiscal policy and climate policy. Donald Trump is not a fan of many of the climate accords, and he thinks everyone can sort of, go stuff themselves when it comes to that. And but really the 3 big ones is that fiscal policy of tax cuts, trade policy of basically a trade war with China, and fixing America's seemingly out of control and really aimless immigration system. So obviously there are some other frameworks which will unfold if the big D became president. Notably in Europe, there is a war going on between Russia and the Ukraine. Donald Trump is very, very pro not being a warmonger, and he is also not a fan of NATO. And really, that will be an interesting space to see unfold if the Ukraine gets cut off from basically support from America. Now, a lot of people in the Republican Party are very pro, keeping up the fight and support for the Ukraine against Russia. But equally, Donald Trump is very much against NATO expansion, which obviously, made Russia very uneasy and, of course, led to the current sort of conflict. Obviously, Trump has shown that he's very pro-Israel. He might be able to strong-arm Israel into also, working out their world. He's tried in the past to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, like most people who have tried, not got very far at all. He will continue to support Taiwan and create a wedge against China. And really, if any geopolitical conversation was to occur based on Trump 2.0, it is the conversation of putting the boot in to China. Yes, China, of course, otherwise known as a knock-off economy, has been knocking off stuff for years. It knocks off everything. If you run a small business, if you manufacture anything, typically anything around the world, the Chinese can work out how to knock it off, whether it's tech, whether it's military, whether it's basically just household goods. And of course, really what Trump wants to do is put the boot into China, constantly knocking off American ideas and using them for their own gain. So if there was to be a second Trump presidency, to understand, I guess, a timeline of what that could look like, in Q4 this year, 2024, so October, November, you will see the US election. That's going to happen. Then, if you can imagine, the big D became the president, then by Q2, June 2025, you will start to see the immigration policy be introduced and start to unfold. That is something that can happen quite quickly. By Q4 2025, you will see the fiscal expansion with things like tax changes lining up with the federal budgetary world over there. And by Q1 2026, you will start to see the tariff hikes on China, which is basically putting a hike on any imports from China. And of course, if we were to examine the migration or immigration policy by Donald Trump, I mean, at the moment, there's about 1.3 million people or net migration into the United States of around 1.3 million people. Trump is changing the system or plans to change the system and drop the number down to more like circa 600,000 people. So very similar to here in Australia, where we're also debating whether we need to halve our migration. It's really no different in the United States. The only difference in the United States, it's a little bit of an aimless immigration model where it just supports all sorts of people coming to the country. In the future, it could look like a more skilled-based Australian-esque immigration model. And of course, if we were to forecast really US consumption, expenditures and investment off the back of what Trump is looking to do, we can see that ultimately it would actually, if you use some modeling, lead to a more powerful corporations, capitalist kind of country. You will see the ability for the country to actually grow. It may go through a period of instant inflation because of basically things costing more. And so that will have to be something to watch against how the interest rate world in America is used. And of course, if we look at, I guess, Trade War One, Donald Trump came out with some big statements about, imposing trade restrictions on China, and then tempered them throughout his presidency. But if you went to a limited Trump tariff model, the US could impose, say, 25% tariffs on electronics, machineries, chemicals, any sort of imports from China. In retaliation, China would impose, for example, 10% tariffs on US imports. So it'll be a bit of a tit for tat world that could unfold. If Trump went even extremer, if he wins more seats, for example, through the Republican Party, it could be up to a 60% tariff on Chinese goods and imports. China then could raise its response to, say, 40% on US goods, and the US could retaliate with a shutdown on really China having access to new technology, and that comes out of the US. So there's all sorts of, I guess, what could happen. But either way, I think really the US and China situation is going to be something that will need to be watched. And of course, the 2018-2019 Trump trade war obviously created some scenarios which ultimately saw basically a slowdown in US even importing goods from China and creating new pipelines to other countries. So winners actually happen by virtue of really the US finding other trade partners. And off the back of the last trade war, for example, Vietnam became an absolute winner of producing knockoff goods and sending them into America. So last time around, imports dropped from basically the US importing from China, and it dropped by quite a substantial amount, around 20%. And of course, this is the flow-on effect to what could happen to China. China could end up in a place where it's struggling, and of course that has some trickle-down economic impacts for Australia. But if we were to look at the US dollar and where that could head off the back of a Trump presidency, it could actually end up going up, and the long-term government bond, US bond, could end up being circa around 4% for really the rest of the decade. And again, what that means for Australia is probably Australia needing to consider where its interest rates sit. But if Australia is going to have an impact from where China is going to sit, because Australia and China are trading partners, then potentially the Australian dollar could come under threat off the back of a higher US dollar and higher US interest rates. So it'd be very, very interesting. And of course, China is currently in deflation. China is basically on its knees. It's got a massive, massive problem in its property market over in China. Basically, during and before COVID, the country went through a period of hyper building. It built too much real estate. It went through hyper supply, the complete opposite here in Australia. In Australia, we can't build anything. In China, they build everything, and literally millions and millions of properties built for a rising forecast or bad data on where its population growth was headed. And of course, it went into population decline and overbuilt millions and millions of apartments. Of course, what that has led to is really a fallout in the construction sector, a fallout in the housing market, and a fallout for more steel inputs into China. Of course, steel comes from iron ore, and Australia is one of the big iron ore producers around the world. So the Chinese government is probably doing the opposite to every other OECD country in the world, which has had to put rates up because of a healthy economic world. China's world is the opposite. It's been putting rates down. And of course, excuse me, the People's Bank of China has basically cut rates and is circa 2.3%. Their cash rate is 2.3%. Australia's cash rate, 4.35%. So big difference in what is going on. China's growth has certainly stalled. And of course, Trump 2.0, if there is to be a trade war with China and Trump sparks tariffs, this will, in Q1 2026, probably have an impact on the Chinese economy. And so you may see a Chinese struggling economy, a property market which is already going through a bit of a meltdown. And of course, the diplomatic strain that will create between Australia and China and Australia and America. Australia and America obviously are partners within defense, and Australia and China are the close trading partners. Now, the Albanese government has done a good job of restoring trading activities between Australia and China. And, interesting, we had our own trade war with China basically up until a year ago. So we are doing a lot more business with China, albeit China is going through a softening of really what it can produce and how fast it can grow. And really, it's probably fair to say the rampant growth era of China is over. Australia also needs to find other trading partners and decouple itself from just relying on China. I think to an extent, it really is doing that. It is lined up a lot of work with, for example, India. And really today, the number one country that we're connected to, particularly from a inbound immigration policy, is really lined up towards the next big economy, which is that of India. But certainly if there's less goods needing to be produced from China going into America, then that's going to obviously create a level of less need for demand for materials and minerals. And you got to understand, the US is huge. It is huge. Hundreds of millions of people. I know from running a dysfunctional import-export business myself back in the day that just to buy a 40-foot container of stuff. Very, very difficult for a small Australian company because you are competing with America. And American companies will buy 1,000 containers and a small Australian company wants 5 containers. And of course, for the factories in China, they can't obviously prioritize an Australian order over a US order. However, one could argue that the cost of Chinese goods could come down and actually that deflation help the cost of living crisis in Australia, i.e. a TV could become cheaper, a Chinese TV, because if Americans aren't going to be buying them, or there's less being sent to America, potentially the Australian market could be flooded with low Chinese goods, which obviously could come at a time where household spending could use the cheap knockoff Chinese goods. Obviously, if you were to consider the vulnerability of Australia and China, there is a level of vulnerability, particularly around iron ore exposure. And of course, that dependency on trade is something that the Australian government needs to be very, very mindful of. It's always been a weird relationship, China's got obviously its own sort of geopolitical power plays. It pays off small island countries to allow them to use parts of their country. It buys basically countries out of debt to play this kind of geopolitical kind of big game. And of course, Australia has a weird relationship with China. It loves doing business with it, but politically doesn't really favor some of its maneuvers at a global level. And of course, if America was to put China in a very vulnerable rate, remember its cash rate is now 2.3%. Really, it's got a little bit of wiggle room there to drop to sustain a further economic shock. But it could be fair to say the cash rate in China could be very, 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 very low. And of course, if China was to tip into an economic lull, it's going to decrease its need for iron ore. And again, we can probably see that reduced consumer spending in China will have an basically effect on some of Australia's kind of iron ore producers. Now, if we go back to June 2024, the iron ore price peaked at $1.43, and right now, at the time of recording, which is in late July 2024, the iron ore price, spot price, is $1.07. So it's come down from $1.43 to $1.07. So a big fall away in what its value is. Now, Australia is pretty good at overcoming these problems. And the reason it's pretty good at overcoming these problems is it loves population economics. Bring more people here, sell them more houses, start more coffee shops, basically put more people in your economy, and they will spend. As they will spend, your economy will grow. Everyone has more things to sell. When you're a services economy, you're either doing a service or you're selling something. And so Australia's services economy loves the position it's in because it still can grow to, say, a 40 million person country without, spilling into too many economic challenges by using the prop-up process of more people coming into the economy. But obviously, if China slows down because of Trump 2.0, the need for more resources needs to be considered. And obviously, China is a big place. There's 1 billion people. So Australian government obviously gets a lot of tax revenue from iron ore. If there's less iron ore being sold at a higher price, that's just basically less taxes being created. It's also lower corporate earnings for mining companies. So they may look at shredding some jobs as an impact of lower corporate earnings. And obviously regional economies, which are heavily dependent on mining, could end up suffering. And again, this is where you get that kind of boom bust effect of those small regional mining market towns, which I constantly tell people don't invest in because of the fluctuation of volatility. Obviously, if the government has less or reduced tax, it tends to want to find taxes elsewhere. This is where, anything could happen. They could start to try and rob property investors. They could try and start to rob corporations. They could come up with all sorts of ways to find tax revenue. More the reason as to why you've got to take control of your own world, by the way, because, the government is under its own fiscal pressures. So lower iron ore royalties effectively will, play out maybe for the next couple of years. And obviously, that can also lead to a period of decreased investment in basically mining projects. So less looking for more mining particulars, mining minerals, and you get that kind of slowdown effect. But equally, Australia's pretty well poised because it's got lithium and it's got a few other things like cobalt and copper, which is really what is going on when it comes to green energy. So there is a bit of counter activity along those lines. But our currency could depreciate. So if Trump maybe gets in, maybe by 2026, there could be a very big variation in our currencies. We might not be going to Europe. So if you want to go to Europe, maybe do it this year. Obviously, if there was to be a bit of a slowdown, that means interest rates will have to come down to stimulate the economy, which obviously property investors absolutely love. Property investors kind of love slowdowns as long as they've got their job. And of course, if you're not exposed to the mining market, you're in the services economy like most of us, then it could actually lead to lower interest rates, which leads to property investors making money out of the wealth effect through higher house prices, which again, it is what it is. Trade balances, it could mean that Australia's trade is negatively impacted. In other words, you get a current account deficit of basically more imports exceeding less exports, and that is a plausibility. I know the Western Australian government's onto this. They've already earmarked some other major construction projects starting that will allow for a lot of workers to take up roles in green energy. By way of example, Western Green Energy Hub is suggested to start its commercial operation. It's basically the biggest windmill project the world's ever seen, and the estimated construction worker workforce just to deliver that project is inputted at 43,500 people. So with the transfer to green energy, you may actually see that Australia's slowdown in iron ore could be a bit of a blessing in disguise for creating new innovation and new production levels of other activities. So that's the trickle-down effect of Trump. That is ultimately where it could end up. And so, again, no one's got a crystal ball. Who knows? Could be Robert F. Kennedy or JFK, or he could make it, the man with the huskiest voice in the world. Or it could be even America's first female president. So we never know. But obviously, Trump, he gets a lot of attention. So we'll see where it ends up. All right, folks, thanks for listening. I hope that was helpful. I'll catch you on a new episode next week as we talk more real estate. Thanks for tuning in to the Urban Property Investor. To never miss an episode, make sure you subscribe to the podcast on your favorite app or on YouTube. I would love it if you could give the show a rating and share it with your friends and family. In between episodes, you can always keep in touch with me by connecting on social media over Facebook, Instagram, or LinkedIn. Until we meet again on the next episode of the Urban Property Investor, take care and bye for now.